President Cyril Ramaphosa says the last 5 years has been a time of recovery, rebuilding and renewal of the economy. The President has also acknowledged that public institutions will need to be rebuilt following an era of state capture. But these admissions will not likely sit well with many South Africans who are contending with the direct impact of years of state looting. Joining us now is Professor Amanda Gouws from Stellenbosch University. Prof, a very good afternoon and thank you so much for joining us.
Good afternoon. Thank you for having me.
Prof, as sort of expected, there was bound to be some criticism to the President's State of the Nation address last night. I mean, generally, from your vantage point, what did you make of his speech?
Well, I have dubbed it the Sona of the parallel universe because there is what is in that document that the President presented, and then there's reality on the ground where people live. And the two are disconnected. So it is though the President and his administration live in a parallel universe. And I'm saying that because every year we hear a lot of statistics. And those statistics tell a good story. And of course, the President had to tell a good story because we're in an election year. But the point is that the major things that really need attention, like, for example, just the basic needs, delivery for people on their basic needs like water and constant load shedding. So water, electricity, roads that need to be repaired, infrastructure decay, crime, very high levels of crime. These things are not addressed. So there's certain paradoxes in that State of the Nation address. For example, the President told us that at the end of apartheid, there were 8 million people in the economy. Now there's 16 million. So we start on a very low, we set the bar very low there. But then he also tells us how many people are on grants. And there are more people on grants than there are people in the economy. So that is not a good story. He tells us that the private sector will, in a compact with the state, fix Transnet's problems. But he doesn't tell us anything about organized crime and the syndicates that are actually responsible for what's happening to Transnet and the ports, and how they are very deeply ingrained in the problems that we are now experiencing that's really putting a dent into the economy. So it's those paradoxes, and rather than giving us a holistic picture to say we need to deal with crime, we need to grow the economy, and dealing with issues that are really close to the people, we get the statistics, and we are being killed with statistics in every Sona. It's the same every year.
Prof, is it a deliberate disconnect from the presentation, or is the President really not in touch, and him and his speechwriters, I would presume, not in touch with what is happening on the ground?
I don't think that they're not in touch, but I think the problem here is that in order to address the problems, the ANC have to take accountability. And to take accountability, they have to say we failed. Our governance is not good enough to deal with some of these problems, and they're just not prepared to do that. So now there's been fingers pointed at the global economy, at the war in the Ukraine, at the Houthis in the Red Sea, and then at his predecessor, who he now blames for state capture. The point is, the President was the Deputy President under President Zuma. He was part of what was going on during state capture. So we can't taking a step back and saying I wasn't responsible is just, I think, not being honest. So there are a lot of things blamed except the bad governance of the ANC, especially on local government level where basic service delivery takes place. And I think this is what people will want to hear. It's about the ANC taking responsibility and accountability and say, we have failed in some respects, but we are going to try to do better, and this is what we're going to do. This is what the roadmap looks like. There's talk of a roadmap, but we have no idea what that roadmap looks like.
Would you then say that he, I guess, missed the target, particularly because this is an election year? One would have thought that this would be the ideal time to I guess, inspire some confidence in the people of South Africa?
Yes, indeed. I mean, I think the expectations are not that high in terms of what the people expect. The people just want to hear that their problems will be addressed. And I don't think, I mean, talking about, and of course, we are also celebrating 30 years of democracy. So there's a lot of sort of overview of the 30 years and the good things that have been done. Again, through statistics, you know, having done deliver so much of this and so much of that. People are struggling. We have a cost of living crisis. People, you know, don't even have enough food to eat. And they want to hear how this is going to be addressed. To tell them all the success stories that are really far removed from their living conditions, I think is part of the problem. And if you want to inspire voters, you need to go down to the voter. You can't talk over the heads of the voters.
The president painted the picture of a Dintswalo who is about 30 years old. As much as the story of Dintswalo might resonate with some South Africans, but it seems like the majority of South Africans, they say, well, they look at Dintswalo from a different perspective. Was that part of the president trying to show some of the successes over the past 30 years?
Well, I think so. So, you know, singling out the single person and sort of telling us what the potential is for success is a good thing. But I think if you're going to look at people who were born right around the time of transition and where many of them have ended up, you know, many of them in RDP houses that are falling apart, cannot access the economy, could not go to tertiary education, then, you know, one person's story is not everyone's story. And he actually said that. But we need to look at the balance here. How many people have made it out of the cycle of poverty and how many people are still there? And I think this is another sort of contradiction in that Sona, because he was telling us about, you know, the success of our education system. We've just put 800,000 new matriculants into the economy. And at the same time, we hear that the unemployment rate is still very high, and, you know, that more jobs need to be created and that the private sector needs to come to the party. And I mean, that doesn't really inspire a lot of hope for those 800,000 kids who've just gone into the economy. Many of them are not going to tertiary education.
He touched on rebuilding public institutions after the era of state capture. And as you've touched on a little bit earlier on, Prof, that, well, I mean, he can't really divorce himself from state capture. But what do you make of that? That he's saying, well, we have to rebuild. Because of that, we have to start, and we are in this process of getting these public institutions right.
Well, you know, it's hard to see where we are in the process of getting the public institutions right, because all our SOEs are in dire straits. Most of them are dysfunctional. And the biggest one of them, of course, is Eskom. And we all know the ailments of Eskom and that it's not been fixed. Last year, we were introduced to a state of disaster. The president didn't talk to us in the entire year about what's happening to that state of disaster. We got a minister of electricity. Is he dealing with a state of disaster, or, you know, is it like chipping away at the big marble block, one chip a day, and we're going to fix the institutions? The problem with institutions is if you let them decay and if you let them be hollowed out to the extent that ours were, that turnaround is very, very difficult, and rebuilding is very difficult and very costly. So under the watch of the ANC, we've seen these institutions being hollowed out, being used as the private playground for politicians that put money into their own pockets. That puts a huge pressure on the taxpayer. And I mean, there are 60 million people in this country, and there's only 7 million people who pay personal tax. So there's a huge skewed balance here, and I think this is part of the problem. You can only squeeze the taxpayer for so long, and then you can't do it anymore. And I don't see the government trying to put more people into the economy so that we can have more taxpayers. So that tax base will dwindle. He says that SARS is now extracting more tax and doing it in a way, and that's good. We need the tax for the service delivery, but does the tax go for service delivery or does it go into the pockets of corrupt politicians? And that's very unclear. So the president was elected on the platform of dealing with corruption. But since today, there's not, up to today, there's not been a prosecution of any of the main people that was singled out by the Zondo report. So how seriously is the Zondo report being taken? And to what extent are we going to see these people being prosecuted? And I think this is what the citizens look at, and they think, how serious has a president that comes in on the platform of anti-corruption been to deal with corruption?
Well, the irony of the ESCOM thing is that immediately after his speech, load shedding was ramped up to stage 4 after some of those promises that were made. But, Prof, just looking at that issue of ESCOM per se, because if you look at an ordinary Tintswalo who was watching the State of the Nation address and does not have all those things that the president spoke about, would look at issues like simpler things like roads, safety and security, issues of gender-based violence, job creation. Yeah. And you spoke about the number of, issues of the youth where we're seeing young people going into tertiary education, yet there's not even enough space. Do you think those are the things that the president should have focused on that would have a direct impact on an ordinary person on the street?
Absolutely. If we take the NSFAS disaster of last year, right, there are students still waiting for last year's money. So, we have to be assured that NSFAS will function better this year, that, potholes will be fixed. The president say there's a plan to fix potholes. But Johannesburg is the economic hub of the country, and it's dire in Johannesburg. The infrastructure decay and the roads decay and so on. So I think, and there are towns without water. So the president is telling us about how he's going to build dams and how we're all going to have water. It's not good enough. It's again the promises, and not saying, how are those promises going to be fulfilled? And I think so people who are disillusioned, and I think this speaks to the opinion polls that show that the ANC supporters there's a possibility that it can go below 50%. There was another poll that looked at the leaders of political parties, and in that poll, 90% of that sample said that President Ramaphosa has to go. So it's not a pretty picture, and I think one would have expected a Sona where there's also a bit of mea culpa, we will do better. But I don't think it touched the hearts of the voters who need to vote in the next election.
Would that then be the issue where, and for instance, as said that in an election year, one would have expected the president to be a little bit more closer to the people, but is that where the whole separation of party and state comes in, that he was not talking to us specifically as an ANC president that would make those promises to the people if they are elected, but already as a sitting president?
Yeah, of course, he's supposed to be, non-partisan in his role as the head of state. But, of course, the ANC has never been non-partisan in the sense that it rules to the benefit of all the citizens. I mean, I think there's a very specific way that the ANC governs, and so. But of course, as the head of state, he had to talk as the head of state. But I mean, we also know that the ANC is the ruling party. So I mean, and if he talks as the head of state in an election year, there is the expectation that he also speaks to the citizens who have to vote.